Ted, my children are never going to believe you said all those nice things, so you better send that to me by email so I can show it to them. And also, I want to know, how do you win a national motorcycle award? That's the one. That's the one that every writer is lusting for. Thank you so much. Thank you also, a very warm thank you to Marie Carrière, who's been working with her colleagues for a long time to make it possible for me to come out here, and I really appreciate that. I had a wonderful time also meeting Dr. Schloss and Mrs. Schloss, and thank you to all of you for welcoming me here, and thank you to the Canadian Literature Centre for having such an important focus on literature, Canadian literature, which is known and loved all around the world. Since I'm not sure how long this is going to take me, I'm going to jump right in with one funny little story, and that is that I was debating whether or not to wear a tie tonight. I don't usually wear ties. I didn't even wear one to my wedding. But I thought maybe I should. So I struggled with that for a while, and I asked Marie if she could show me where to find a store to buy a tie in Edmonton. And that reminded me that a publicist that I know that helped me out a lot with HarperCollins in Toronto told me this funny story about Michael Chabon, the terrific American novelist, and I guess you probably know best his book, The Yiddish Policeman's Union, which it has this hilarious premise that the promised land for Jews after World War II is Alaska. And that would have been something else. And anyway, Michael came to Toronto, and because he's a very erudite, intelligent guy, the thing he really wanted the publicist to help him find was a place where he could buy poutine. And so they spent 2 hours driving around Toronto in search of a place that offered the best poutine. Why was he thinking Toronto poutine? He should have been thinking Montreal for that. So, moving on to the course of this talk, I'll just begin by hydrating. I'm thinking a lot about hydrating since I'm writing a novel about a marathon runner. I was a very bad marathon runner for some years, but he's made one. The title of my lecture this evening will be, Dear Sir, I Intend to Burn Your Book. And the subtitle will be An Anatomy of a Book Burning. In June of 2011, less than a month after launching the Dutch edition of my novel, The Book of Negroes, in the Netherlands, I received the most surprising email of my life. Let me read it to you verbatim. Dear Sir Lawrence Hill, we, descendants of the enslaved in the former Dutch colony of Suriname, want to let you know that we do not accept the book with the title, The Book of Negroes. We struggled for a long time to let the word nigger disappear from Dutch language, and now you set up your Book of Negroes. A real shame. That's why we make the decision to burn this book on the 22nd of June, 2011. Maybe you do not know, but June is the month before the 1st of July, the day that we remember the abolition from the Dutch, who put our ancestors in slavery. Sincerely, Roy Groenberg, Chairman, Foundation Honor and Restored Victims of Slavery in Suriname. End of email. Attached to the email was a handwritten poster saying in Dutch, summons to Afro-Surinamese Dutch people to come to book burning in Oosterpark near the monument. I wrote a reply that, in retrospect, seems outrageously Canadian in its politeness and tact. Here's what I said. Dear Mr. Groenberg, I'm very sorry to hear of your plans to burn my book. Are you aware of the historical origins of the title? It's a historical novel. The Book of Negroes is the name of a British military ledger that documents the exodus of 3,000 African Americans from New York City to Nova Scotia, Canada, at the end of the American Revolutionary War. It's a very important genealogical document, as it provides a great deal of biographical information about the blacks who migrated from the USA to Canada in 1783. The original copy of this document is kept in the National Archives of the UK. The document is central to my novel. My main character must have her name entered into the Book of Negroes before she, like 3,000 other blacks fleeing American slavery, is allowed to sail to Canada. The use of the title, the Book of Negroes, or Het Negerboek in Dutch, has offered me the opportunity to explain this history, which is fascinating, important, and troubling, to many thousands of readers in Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. I've found that when given the opportunity to see what I'm doing in this book and with this title, readers understand that the title is not intended to be offensive, but that it is used historically to shed light on a forgotten document and on a forgotten migration, that of thousands of blacks from the USA to Canada in 1783. Did you know that I gave a talk recently about this book, its historical origins, and the title to the Surinamese group NINSE in Amsterdam last month? Before you proceed with your plans to burn my novel, would you like to have a conversation about this? Thank you, Lawrence. I'm a true Canadian. As you may imagine, the conversation never took place. Mr. Grunberg went on to burn not the real book, but copies of the novel, copies of the cover of the novel for Dutch TV cameras in the popular Oosterpark in Amsterdam, next to a monument commemorating the victims of Dutch slavery. I don't know why he pulled back. Maybe the burning papers sufficed for the photographers. From a comfortable chair on this side of the ocean, I suppose some might find the entire episode laughable, but it really shook me up. Obviously, I felt deeply troubled that a work to which I'd given 5 years of passion and attention should attract such a hateful act. To me, the entire point of the novel was to offer dignity, depth, and dimensionality to a person whose very humanity would have been assaulted as a slave. From my perspective, Mr. Grunberg and I should have been on the same side of issues having to do with the treatment and depiction of people in the African diaspora. My publisher felt ashamed to see the book assailed in this manner and defended it vigorously. She received a death threat and decided not to attend the book cover burning. It wasn't the first time the title of my novel has encountered difficulties. Several months after it appeared in Canada under the title The Book of Negroes, my American publisher informed me right before going to the printer that it was changing the name of the novel. Why? Because U.S. bookstores were refusing to place advance orders for the novel because the word Negroes was in the title. I was on book tour in Germany at the time that I received this last-minute email from my editor in Manhattan, and the most I could negotiate was that I would be the one to come up with a new title for the American edition. I had about 72 hours to conjure up that title and found it with the assistance of my then 10-year-old stepdaughter, Eve Friedman, more on her later, in a little hotel in the town of Greifswald in the former East Germany on the Baltic Sea. In the United States, and later in Australia and New Zealand, my novel was published under the title Someone Knows My Name. It was a frustrating exercise. I didn't like having the title changed, but as time went on, I came to appreciate that the word Negroes has become offensive in American culture, particularly in black urban culture, where its meaning has evolved over time. My father proudly called himself a Negro for most of his life. Indeed, when he was named chair of the Ontario Human Rights Commission in 1973, the Globe and Mail ran a headline that said, "Commission appoints Negro chair." It was meant to be a polite headline, but that was 1973. Times have changed. These days, on the streets of urban America, calling a person a Negro implies that he or she is an inauthentic black person with no self-pride and no self-respect. While I've been on book tours in the States, over and over, African Americans have come up to me and said, "It's a good thing you changed the title of your book, because I would never have bought your book or come to hear you speak if you'd called it the Book of Negroes down here." So, in joining J.K. Rowling and Alice Munro is just some of the many British and Canadian writers whose titles have been altered to suit the whims of American publishers. I eventually came to appreciate there was a deep, simmering anger over the use of the word Negro in contemporary America. The word is far more explosive on the streets of Brooklyn, say, than in Edmonton. Try it out for yourself, if you don't believe me. Using it in Edmonton will probably earn you the look, as if to say, "Have you not opened the pages of a newspaper for 30 years? If you use it in Brooklyn, be sure to travel with good health insurance." The fact of the title change of my novel in certain markets, followed up by the burning of the cover of the Book of Negroes in Amsterdam, led me to reflect more deeply on the issues of historical injustices faced by racial, religious, and other minorities, in the myriad ways that both victims and perpetrators of injustice have taken to burning, censoring, and banning books historically and today. It also led me to reflect about appropriate translations of the book moving forward. In Quebec and in France, the title of the Book of Negroes has been translated as Aminata, the name of my protagonist. I, for one, insisted, while the translation was being developed, that there was no good literal translation for the Book of Negroes in French, and that however it came out, it would end up sounding flat and crass. After the problems in the Netherlands, a German publisher offered on the novel. I made sure the publisher was aware of the problems that had arisen in the Netherlands, and I believe the decision has been made to base the German title on the American, Someone Knows My Name. There's something particularly odious about burning a book, or a pile of books. The action aims not just to remove the offending article from the hands of readers, but to silence and intimidate writers, publishers, and booksellers. Readers, too. It suggests that they too will be burned if they do not heed the message. You will not be tolerated. Your ideas will not be discussed. We must protect society from your toxic mind, so we're lighting this bonfire. As early as the year 1141, the Talmud was burned in Paris on charges of blasphemy. The leaders of the Spanish Inquisition burned books. Nazis burned books. And did they ever? Many books have been written on the subject of banning and censoring books, but one that can be recommended for its clarity and brevity is Forbidden Fruit, banned, censored, and challenged books from Dante to Harry Potter by Pierce Kerfoot. Forbidden Fruit notes that in Berlin's Opernplatz on May 10, 1933, Nazis burned 25,000 volumes by Jewish and other ostensibly seditious writers. Tossed into the raging fires were, among others, works by Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Helen Keller, Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Mann, and Albert Einstein. Book burning is not something limited to the Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition, and antiquity. Just last year, a preacher from Gainesville, Florida, publicly burned a copy of the Quran, despite a direct plea from President Obama to refrain from such a hateful act of religious intolerance. And in 2010, a group of university students in India burned copies of Such a Long Journey, a beautiful novel, by the way, which was written by the Indo-Canadian novelist Rohinton Mistry and won the Governor General's Literary Prize in 1991. These same students intimidated the University of Mumbai into dropping the book from the syllabus. Why? The leader of the book burners complained of obscene and vulgar language in the novel and of negative references to India's nationalist politicians. I happen to love Rohinton Mistry's novels, especially A Fine Balance, which I feel bears a spiritual resemblance to the Book of Negroes. Although we've never had a proper conversation, I feel an additional kinship to Rohinton Mistry when I learned that his writing too had been burned overseas. Perhaps Rohinton and I should form a club. After all, writers have all sorts of associations. Once, I had lunch in Calgary with 3 other novelists, and we were all whining about the nasty literary reviews that we had endured. I thought that my story of an unfavorable review in Edmonton would impress my lunchmates, but my late friend Paul Cornington took the top prize. One of his novels had earned in a newspaper this critical headline, quote, "Trashy book, waste of paper." So if writers bound to talk business or to impose the incarceration of our peers or to argue for better royalties for our ebook publications, perhaps we should also be gathering to form a support group for those who've had their books burned. Let me return to a serious note. Some friends and family members were surprised to see how much Mr. Gronberg's email upset me. I was surprised myself. Earlier in my career, when very few people had heard of my books, I sometimes joked with writer friends that all I needed was to be the subject of a good book censorship campaign. That for sure would increase my sales. I suppose that a few writers whose books are banned, censored, or burned end up gaining a few extra sales, but many of them face the more likely possibility of seeing publishers, bookstores, and others back away. Who wants to be associated with a writer who will cause trouble, or stir controversy, or attract vigorous public criticism? I have a troubled relationship with my book burners in Amsterdam. One emotional challenge for me in dealing with the issue was that the book burners were a handful of Dutch people of Surinamese descent. Suriname, in South America, was one of the most important slave colonies of the Dutch. In the broader diaspora of African peoples, these are my own people. And it hurts, frankly, when your own people reject you or tell you that you don't belong or challenge the very identity that you've shaped for yourself. I don't agree with those who burned my book, but I empathize with them. And that the troubling relationship we have with books that offend us deeply is what I want to talk about. I'm not merely a writer and a reader with an obvious bias in favor of the freedom to read and write. I'm also a parent of 5 children and the son of a woman and a man who devoted much of their lives to the cause of advancing human rights in Canada. My late father, Daniel G. Hill, was an African American born in Independence, Missouri in 1923. He served as a soldier in the highly segregated American Army in World War II. Up to the end of that war, he was reminded most days of his life that he was a black man with second-class rights as an American citizen, good enough to die for his country, but not to eat in restaurants with white people, drink from their water fountains, swim in their pools, or for that matter, fall in love with one of their daughters. My mother, Donna Hill, was a white American born in 1928 in South Dakota, but raised in Oak Park, Illinois. She navigated the miraculous early life transition of leaving behind her conservative family roots to become a civil rights activist. After my parents met and fell in love in one of the only 2 racially integrated housing co-ops in Washington, D.C. in 1952, they married and the next day left the USA forever. They moved to Toronto, where my mother continued her work in social activism. She called it shit-kicking. And my father began his PhD studies in sociology at the University of Toronto. Yes, I'm the child of 2 sociologists. Consider me a survivor. What else is there but emotional survival when one's father catches one pummeling one's brother, pulls out a scholarly book by French sociologist Émile Durkheim, points a finger and calls out deviant behavior? My father didn't have much time for children exhibiting deviant behavior. He was busy finishing his PhD thesis, circa 1960, called Negroes in Toronto, a Sociological Study, and a few years later creating the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the first commission of its kind in Canada. Human rights, Black history in Canada, the stories of slavery, the end of slavery, and the civil rights movement in this country and in the USA formed part of our kitchen table talk at home in Don Mills, a sleepy, affluent, overwhelmingly white suburb of Toronto. My father is no longer around to answer my detailed questions, but I distinctly remember him telling me that when I was very young, he argued against the use of racist textbooks and books in public schools in Ontario. He was sensitive to outrageous descriptions and depictions of Black people and other minorities in literature. And by the time he was hitting his full stride as a young professional in the 1960s and 70s, felt fully ready to do battle with those books. One of the books that most outraged him was Little Black Sambo. For those of you who don't know, Little Black Sambo is a children's book written by Helen Bannerman and first published in 1899. The original character appears as a boy from India, but over time, the character, in North America especially, is seen to be Black. Sambo, like Aunt Jemima, is a catch-all, hurtful name meant to refer to Black people who are in a subjugated, menial, servile position. Sambo evokes the image of the North American slave who is satisfied with his state of servitude. In this famous children's story, Sambo surrenders his fancy clothes to 4 tigers so they will not eat him. The vain tigers chase each other around a tree and melt into a pool of butter. Sambo recovers his clothes, and his mother, whose name is Black Mumbo, uses the butter to make 169 pancakes. Black Sambo, eats them all. The depiction of the character Little Black Sambo falls into the camp of pickaninny stereotyping that offends many African Canadian and African American readers. Black Sambo has every stereotype going. bare feet, flashy clothes, exaggerated facial features, and gluttony to boot. If that does not suffice, he sports the name of a servile slave. I don't remember if my father called for the book to be yanked from Ontario schools. I asked this lifelong friend and confidant, Alan Bourvoy, now retired, but the former general counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, but he couldn't remember either exactly what battle my father might have fought on that front. I asked Alan, a vigorous defender of free speech, even on unpopular fronts, such as arguing that disseminators of hate literature should not be prosecuted in Canada, and he answered that it was one thing to try to ban a book completely in society, and less aggressive to argue that a school or school board should not be giving its imprimatur to racist literature. But this is where we fall into very tricky territory. Half the world, it seems, wants to pull one book or another off the school shelves because the children just aren't ready for it. On the one hand, you have your basic left-wingers, like my father and me, who'd be scandalized to think that a teacher in the year 2012 would want to have grade 1 kids reading Little Black Sambo. On the other hand, you have your right-wing and fundamentalist groups that object to the children's book And Tango Makes Three, the true story of two gay penguins raising a baby penguin in the zoo in New York Central Park Zoo. Just imagine if the left-wingers and the right-wingers formed a coalition. They could yank half the books out of the Canadian school curriculum. Together, they could ensure that no school or public library would ever be allowed to provoke, disturb, challenge, offend, or outrage another reader for the rest of time. They could control our minds forever after. In the publicly funded shelves of schools and libraries, the only thing we would have left is Anne of Green Gables. I think I can dispense of two matters immediately. I wouldn't want any book in a library or bookstore banned, pulled, removed, or burned. Period. We can hate them, dissect them, learn from them, or praise them, but we need to leave books alone and let readers come to terms with them. We can teach young people to be aware and critical thinkers, but to believe that we can protect young people from the ideas in literature is self-delusional in the extreme. In today's electronic age, dissidents who are prosecuted and persecuted in countries such as China are more likely to be bloggers than novelists. Still, even in the year 2012, the book holds a special place in the world of argument. To those who would ban them and to those who would defend them, books remain symbols of ideas, defiance, originality, and individuality, loved by some for the very same reasons that they are despised by others. From a practical standpoint, book censorship seems ludicrous. You can find all manner of violence, hate, pornography, and filth on the internet, and on television, and in film. We don't seem to get too exercised about that. Many or most young people in Canada have access to the net and to television, and a great many of them have unrestricted access. Between the net and television and film, there's something in the palette of colors to meet virtually every definition of gross, and to offend virtually every person on the planet. But heaven forbid that our children read a book about gay penguins in Central Park. It seems misplaced, in a case of taking colossally unfair aim at literature, to scream so loud over the perceived offensiveness in literature alone. Now let's consider the thornier problem of grossly hateful or offensive material in the schools. What do we do about that? Is there such a thing as free speech? Not really. You are not allowed to stand on a street corner in Canada and incite people to violence. It is, rightly, in my opinion, against the Criminal Code of Canada to disseminate hate literature in this country. Clearly, there's room for only so many books in a grade 3 classroom or in a grade 11 English curriculum, or in a school library for that matter. Somebody has to decide which books should be bought, made available to students in libraries, and taught. And it's only normal that a range of society values will influence the decisions of those who are buying books for students and teaching children in the classroom. I openly admit that in the neighborhood of Hamilton, where I live with my wife and children, I'd be appalled if I found a grade 1 teacher teaching racist literature to a 6-year-old or her 6-year-old charges. I'm sure I would have some questions to ask. I would make sure to speak with my own children, although mine are now well past that age, about the book and its bias and its limitations in my view. This is my right as a parent. But unless the book violated our hate laws or some other Canadian law, I don't believe that I could argue that it should be removed entirely from the school library or made inaccessible to children who want to read it. I think the hypocrisy of saying, I can read this and handle it, but others must be protected from it, applies to children too. Books are expressions of human thought. If they're published, then they are legitimate targets of criticism and dissent. But I just don't think we should be burning or banning them or choosing to make them inaccessible. Anyway, I can't really argue to pull a book I happen to hate from the shelves because it would then be impossible for me to defend other books against attacks led by other people. I've already waded into 2 public fights over the use of books in the schools of Ontario where I live. Ice. Excuse me. In one case, they didn't tell me there was ice in class. In one case, about 15 years ago, a group of people in the Haltic District School Board banded together under the rather unbelievable acronym PACT. Unbelievably, this stands for Parents Against Corrupt Teachers. PACT formed in Halton to do battle against a novel called Foxfire by the American literary icon Joyce Carol Oates. Oates is one of the most famous, prolific, and respected literary novelists in the USA. Her novel, which I've read closely, is about the dynamics of an extremely violent gang of impoverished, abused teenage girls in upper New York State in the middle of the 20th century. Ultimately, the book would leave any thoughtful reader with the impression that they would do well to avoid allowing themselves to fall under the sway of any gang at all. It features teenage girls who've been abused and mistreated, and who then form a gang to mete out punishments against those who have hurt them. The girls end up meting out far more severe punishments than they have ever received. And their language is not pretty. There's much dialogue, and suffice it to say that they do not sound like nuns. The members of Parents Against Corrupt Teachers actually assembled a compendium of every single 4-letter word in the book. This word appears on line 4 of page 1. That word appears on line 18 of page 2, etc. It's a long and boring list. And it's entirely beside the point. Still, the group created enough of a fuss to lead the school board to temporarily remove the book from a high school reading list until the matter could be considered further. Personally, I fail to see the need to protect 17-year-old readers from the very language they use with some dexterity on the street. A self-mocking note here. In my own home, I have a super-literate, book-devouring 15-year-old stepdaughter named Eve Friedman, who has a mouth like a soldier. This is the same child who 5 years ago helped me come up with an alternative title for the American edition of my novel. These days, I don't know what to do about all her swearing. She's a bright kid. She surely read more books in her short 15 years than I've read my entire lifetime. My wife, though she flinched, had pretty well given up on Eve's potty mouth and was hoping that she might exit from this phase by her 16th birthday. Fat chance. I came up with an idea. It seems to be working, and it goes like this. Eve is not allowed to swear on the first floor of our house. On the second floor, in her bedroom, for example, or in the bathroom, she may have at it. But no swearing on the main floor. Not in the kitchen, dining room, living room, or in the hall by the front door. Occasionally, she tests me by putting both feet on the first step leading upstairs and letting rip with some foul obscenity. But she's immune on the first step. But she only tried that once or twice to see if I would honor my end of the bargain. By limiting her potty mouth to the second floor, we pretty well got her to cut out 95% of it. After all, she's a teenager, and when she's upstairs, she likes to lock herself in her bedroom. To me, it's entirely laughable that Eve Friedman, queen of the Hamilton potty mouths, would be scandalized by a few hundred choice swear words in Foxfire. But even a Girl Guide or Boy Scout who's never allowed to curse at home will not see their universe upended by reading Joyce Carol Oates. Foxfire happens to be a very good novel. For those who care to read it attentively, it contains a warning to those who would allow their minds to be overtaken by a gang, any gang at all. The second fight I waded into, alongside Eve, had to do with the use of 3 wishes, Palestinian and Israeli children speak, by the Canadian writer Deborah Ellis. 3 Wishes is a work of non-fiction for children. It contains the real monologues in the voices of real children, some Jewish, others Palestinian, who are caught up in the tensions and hatred of living in what is essentially a war zone. Some of the children express fear and hatred of the other. Many display that they have had few or no opportunities to get to know children on the other side of the divide. One of the children interviewed was a sibling of a suicide bomber. This inflamed the Canadian Jewish Congress, and the next thing you knew, this incredibly thoughtful and insightful book, in the voices of children, about their very lives as children in the Middle East, was removed from the hands of children in the Toronto District School Board. Apparently, Palestinian and Israeli children are old enough to live through hell, but children in Canada are not old enough to read about it. Eve went to bat in favor of this book, speaking as I did at a Toronto press conference in its defense. She was 10 at the time. It was interesting to note that in the uproar over whether the book was appropriate to be read by children in school, nobody had thought to ask the opinions of children. Eve adores the books of Deborah Ellis, and she was outraged by the decision to remove the book from a special school reading program. And for her articulate defense of the book, Eve, at the age of 10, became the first child in Canada to win the Freedom to Read Award. Eve does not just own an uncensored potty mouth, it's an award-winning mouth that can be put to intelligent and passionate argument. I have a bizarre little anecdote about book censorship. There are thousands of stories, but this one is just too good to pass up. I got it from Pierce Carefoot's book, Forbidden Fruit. The Naked and the Dead, the first novel by American Norman Mailer, was published in 1946. I've read it, I loved it. It offered a frank, brutal, and utterly unsentimental portrait of the American Army in the South Pacific in World War II. It was a massive bestseller, although the Globe and Mail described it as, quote, pure pornography, unquote. In 1949, it was banned from Canada's bookstores and libraries by Canadian Minister of National Revenue, J.J. McCann, who had jurisdiction over the importation of foreign literature. The minister admitted that he'd never read the book, but based his judgment on the highlighted bits his advisors had deemed salacious. I have another anecdote. I'm excerpting this detail from the annual 2001 Freedom to Read publication released by the Book and Periodical Council. In 1923, the Commissioner of the Department of Customs and Excise directed officers at the border to ban the novel Ulysses by James Joyce from entering Canada. He regarded the novel as obscene and illegal. At the time, no one had the right to appeal a customs ruling to a court. A banned publication stayed on the prohibited list until customs officials changed their minds. Some 26 years later, in 1949, David Dim, the Deputy Minister of the Department of Customs and Excise, read Ulysses while he was on vacation and decided that it was no longer obscene. Without fanfare, Sim lifted the ban and allowed the novel into Canada. Let me reassure you that 1923 and 1949 were not the last time that provocative books were prevented from entering Canada. Books, including gay-themed books, continue to be held up regularly at the border. Books continue to come under fire annually. According to the Book and Periodical Council, some of the many writers of fiction to face challenges of book bans and censorship in Canada include Mordecai Richler, Anthony Burgess, Stephen King, Margaret Atwood, D.H. Lawrence, Alice Munro, John Steinbeck, Salman Rushdie, Charlaine Harris, Timothy Findlay, and Jane Rule. That's just a short sample from a much longer list. Observing the inherent elitism in the decision by authority figures to protect the masses from troublesome literature, Carefoot cites a particularly effective quote from the author Charles Rembar, quote, "I never heard a prosecutor or a condemning judge announce that his moral fiber had been injured by the book in question. It was always someone else's moral fiber for which anxiety was felt." Let's return to Amsterdam. I have that interesting relationship with Dutch people and with the Netherlands. In 1974, at the age of 17, I took off to Europe for the summer with my best friend, a Canadian of Dutch ancestry by the name of Jack Fuglers, who later became a sociologist. We stayed with various members of his extended family, all kinds of aunts, uncles, and grandparents, for about a month. I've since returned a number of times to give readings, to run in a half marathon in Amsterdam as a fundraiser for the Canadian Diabetes Association, and last year to give readings and interviews to launch the Dutch edition of my novel, The Book of Negroes. Friends, publishers, media, and strangers have virtually always treated me kindly and graciously in the Netherlands. I really enjoyed the country and its people. I've made great friends with a number of Dutch people, Canadians of Dutch origin, and those who live in the Netherlands. So please keep that in mind as I tell this bizarre story. Canadians and the Dutch have one unusual point in common. We both tend to deny or sweep under the rug the history of slavery as carried out by our own countries. Slavery was practiced in Eastern Canada, modern-day Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and even PEI, until it was finally abolished through most of the British Empire in 1834. We don't generally like to talk about that, and would far prefer to point an accusatory moral finger at Americans for their own history of slavery, or at South Africans for their history of apartheid. I wrote the Book of Negroes to document a difficult and little-known story of the black loyalists of Nova Scotia. As I mentioned earlier, I gave the novel its name to resurrect a British naval ledger documenting the exodus of 3,000 blacks who fled Manhattan at the end of the Revolution and came to Nova Scotia to insist on their freedom and to cash in on the promises of the British, who'd offer them security and freedom in exchange for service during the American Revolution. When the novel came out in 2011 in the Netherlands, my Dutch publisher gave it a title that was a direct translation from the Book of Negroes. It was called Het Nigger Book. Forgive me for mangling the language, I don't speak Dutch. The Dutch also have a painful history of slavery. The Netherlands, indeed, Holland did not abolish slavery until 1863, the same year as Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. While on book tour in the Netherlands last year, I visited the Middelburg Zeeland archives in the small town of Middelburg in the south of Holland. There I thumbed through the original records of slave ships run by the Middelburg Commercial Company. In the 18th and 19th centuries, that one company alone sold 270,000 Africans into slavery in the former Dutch colony of Suriname. During the 5 years I spent researching the Book of Negroes, I never held in my hands the actual original records of a company that shipped slaves, but I did so in Middelburg and came across numerous dark and painful details. Between about 1730 and the end of the Dutch slavery period, the Middelburg Commercial Company made 113 slave ship journeys to Africa. The company described its human cargo with the following disgusting term, quote, curly cattle, unquote. There are many blatant references to the company's sale of human beings. I won't go into the details. Suffice it to say that it was a painful time in Dutch and American history, and the legacy of this justice lingers and festers in the Netherlands today. The Turkish scholar Jan Urk, who teaches at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, notes that the four biggest immigrant communities in the Netherlands are Turks, Moroccans, Antilleans, and Surinamese. Together they total almost 1 million people in a country of 17 million. Nonetheless, Geert Wilders, an important and influential politician in the country, has gained popularity and political currency by leading a political party that spews anti-Islamic rhetoric. As Jan Urk pointed out last year in an article for Current History, in one media interview, Wilders derided Islam by calling it, and I quote, a violent and retarded religion. Some blacks, North Africans, and Muslims in the Netherlands feel under siege these days. There are two references to black people in contemporary Dutch culture that seem to be particularly offensive to people of Surinamese and other black descent living in the country. I want to mention them because they contextualize the response of Mr. Groenberg in deciding to burn my book cover last year. You've all heard of St. Nicholas. In the Netherlands, December 5th is set aside as a day to celebrate the birthday of Sinterklaas, as he's known there. He has a black helper, a white man who's dressed up in blackface and shown to have exaggerated black features such as thick red lips and a wild mop of an afro, who goes by the name of Zwart Piet or Black Peter. On the day of the annual Sinterklaas parade, Black Peter traditionally cavorts around in pantaloons like a fool and a bumpkin. In some instances, he dispenses candy to good children. In other instances, he carries a rod for punishment and a burlap sack into which unruly or bad children will be stuffed and carted back to Spain, where he and St. Nick come from. I asked Amy Abdu, who works for the National Institute of the Study of Dutch Slavery and its Legacy, to interpret Black Pete to me. Let me provide her answer. Black Peter, Zwart Piet as he's called, emerges after a time when Dutch Parliament were discussing ways to abolish slavery and yet keep the enslaved Africans working on the plantations. At the time of the abolition in 1863 in the Dutch colonies, those who had been enslaved were not truly liberated. They were forced into a sort of reintegration workers' training program that led to 10 more years of indentured servitude. Ms. Abdu goes on to explain that out of this story emerges Zwart Piet, an enslaved man who is so grateful to his liberators that he remains forever in their servitude. The costume that Pete wears in the Sinterklaas celebrations comes directly from the page-like outfits enslaved Africans were forced to wear in the 19th century when they were brought to Europe to serve their masters in their homes. There are several images of these pages in Dutch paintings of this time, often seen with their eyes cast down, helping to dress a wealthy man or woman. Ms. Abdu notes that Zwart Piet inherited many of the same characteristics of the late 19th and early 20th century paintings: thick lips, afro wig, a perpetual look of surprise and stupidity. The tradition of wearing blackface to portray Zwart Piet is most likely an early 20th century invention, following the popularity of minstrel shows in America, and possibly tied to older tradition of men darkening their faces to portray the devil. Up until the 1960s, Zwart Piet played the foil to St. Nicholas's wisdom and goodness. He was the one who doled out punishment with a switch and carried bad children to Spain in a bag. During the 70s and 80s, white Dutch who portrayed Zwart Piet would often assume a Surinamese or Caribbean accent. To this day, you will still see Black Peter cavorting around in a stereotypical manner in the annual Sinterklaas celebrations, and you can imagine how offensive this is to many blacks from the Netherlands and elsewhere who have to put up with it. Perhaps it will change over time. Last year, the annual Sinterklaas celebration in New Westminster, BC, was cancelled over objection to the depiction of Black Pete. Doubtless, many participants, Dutch and Canadians alike, in the Sinterklaas celebrations have no idea of the offense they're causing to people of African descent. They may well not know of the complicated nature of this cultural celebration. To them, it's simply good fun. So one of the benefits of this conversation, like all conversations, is to open up our minds and avenues of dialogue. There's one more stunning reference to blacks in contemporary Dutch culture that ties into the burning of my book cover by some in the Dutch Surinamese community. But before I go there, I want to say that many Western nations offer up stereotypical or disturbing images of blacks. As Ted mentioned during the introduction, when I was growing up in Don Mills, Ontario in the 60s, my mother and father barred the use of any Aunt Jemima products in our household because of the obvious racial stereotyping of the black domestic slave who's ever so happy, day in and day out, to cook up great meals for the people who own her. So we in Canada are fully as guilty of racial stereotyping as the Dutch. But I'm going to speak about the Dutch now because they're the ones who burned my book cover. As I learned when I first traveled to the Netherlands when I was 17, the Dutch have a thing about chocolates and sweet treats. They even sprinkle bits of chocolate on their bread and toast in the morning. It won't surprise you to hear that one of the best known and best loved oral indulgences in the Netherlands is something akin to a chocolate-covered marshmallow. I've not met a single Dutch person who's unfamiliar with this treat. Traditionally, these chocolates have been called negerzonen. That translates as Negro kisses. Historically, old advertising for these chocolates is blatantly racist and trades openly on the most brazen and offensive stereotypes. In one ad, for example, a domineering black woman with huge breasts shrieks at a cowering white man, "Don't you like my kisses?" I could go on and on about these ads, but you can see them for yourself if you Google negerzonen. And this brings us back to the book cover burning. Roy Groenberg, the man who wrote to me to threaten that he would burn my book, and who then went on to burn the cover for the benefit of rolling TV cameras, led the recently successful campaign that persuaded Buys, the manufacturer of the offensive chocolate, to change the name of the chocolate. I applaud Mr. Groenberg for fighting that fight. In other circumstances, I might have stood beside him and agreed with the argument to change the name of those chocolates. Unfortunately for me, if you Google Negroes, you will also find my face in the cover of the Dutch edition of my novel. I understand that Roy Groenberg and his followers are offended by the title, even though he openly states that he has not read the book and will not do so under its current title. And I understand that, especially with the history of slavery and the manifestations of racial disrespect in Holland, that Mr. Groenberg and his followers would react unfavorably to the title of my book. They're entitled to their reactions. I know where they're coming from. In some respects, they're coming from the same place as my father, who some 50 years ago objected to the use of racist literature in Ontario schools. Racial terminology will always fail because it's absurd to define a person by race. In North America, we have witnessed a kaleidoscopic evolution of racial terminology over the last 50 years. Although my father proudly called himself a Negro for most of his life, you can be sure that he would not be using the term today if he were alive. And our own grandchildren are sure to laugh at the terms currently in use, such as black and African Canadian. When they are running the country, they'll bring their own terms into play. I like to imagine what people will be saying instead of Negro, black, or African Canadian in 50 years, and how they will scorn today's terminology. I tell my own children that no single word is entirely out of bounds. One must simply know the heft of each word and use it appropriately. If that means employing discretion around archaic or racist terms, so be it. I don't use Negro in day-to-day language. To this day, I still cringe at the sound of nigger or nigga in hip-hop lyrics, but there is sometimes room to use painful language to reclaim our own history. In other circumstances, if Mr. Groenberg had come to me or my publisher before the book came out and asked to have a conversation about the title, I would have heard him out. If I had become convinced that the title might profoundly offend a number of Surinamese Dutch, I might well have argued for the use of a different title. If Mr. Groenberg had asked me to attend a public meeting to discuss the title, I would have done so. At least we would have had the chance to discuss the matter, and I would have explained the historical roots of the title. I don't agree with his methods, but I suspect that on 9 issues out of 10, with respect to the history and the current situation of peoples of the African diaspora, we're on the same page. The problem, however, with burning and banning books is that it is an intimidating gesture designed to shut down conversation and dialogue. A book burner is not itching for a discussion. A book burner has a match to light, and now. The very purpose of literature is to enlighten, disturb, awaken, and provoke. Literature should get us talking, even when we disagree. Literature should bring us together, not over matches, but over coffee and muffins, and hopefully a bit of recognition of the humanity of the other. Literature should get us laughing together. I can't see any good to come out of burning or banning books. Let's talk instead. Thank you. I believe we're going to have a question period, but just beforehand, since I've spent all that time talking about this book whose cover was burned, I'm going to take 1 minute or so to read you the shortest excerpt from this book. It's just a page to give you a sense of the sound of it. And it's set in London this little bit in the early 1800s, and the narrator, Aminata, is an old woman just a step from the grave. The other day, they took me into a London school and had me talk to the children. One girl asked if it was true that I was the famous Mina D, the one mentioned in all the newspapers. Her parents, she said, did not believe that I could have lived in so many places. I acknowledged that I wasn't Mina D, but that she could call me Aminata Diallo if she wanted, which was my childhood name. We worked on my first name for a while. After 3 tries, she got it. Aminata, 4 syllables. It's really not that hard. Aminata, I told her. She said she wished I could meet her parents and her grandparents. I replied that it amazed me that she still had grandparents in her life. Love them good, I told her, and love them big. Love them every day. She asked why I was so black. I asked why she was so white. She said she was born that way. Same here, I replied. I can see that you must have been quite pretty, even though you are so very dark, she said. You would be prettier if London ever got any sun, I replied. She asked what I ate. My grandfather says he bets you ate raw elephant. I told her I'd never actually taken a bite out of an elephant, but there had been times in my life when I was hungry enough to try. I chased 300 or 400 of them in my life, but never managed to get one to stop rampaging through villages and stand still long enough for me to take a good bite. She laughed and said she wanted to know what I really ate. I eat what you eat, I told her. Do you suppose I'm going to find an elephant walking about the streets of London? Sausages, eggs, mutton stew, bread, crocodiles, all those regular things. Crocodile, she said. I told her I was just checking to see if she was listening. She said she was an excellent listener and wanted me to please tell her a ghost story. Honey, I said, my life is a ghost story. Then tell it to me, she said. As I told her, I'm Aminata Diallo, daughter of Mamadou Diallo and Sira Koulibaly, born in the village of Bayo, 3 moons by foot from the Grain Coast in West Africa. I'm a Bamana and a Fula. I'm both, and we'll explain that later. I suspect I was born in 1745 or close to it. Thank you.